to tackle complex sustainability and business challenges. So without taking any of your thunder, Jesse, I'll swing it over to you. I think you might still be muted, Jesse.
There we go. Yeah, I couldn't find the unmute button for a second. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks to you and Hayan for inviting me. And it's nice to meet all of you and speak with all of you. Thankfully, there's not too much thunder that you can steal from me, Tim. So thank you for the kind introduction anyways. I think you should all be able to see my screen. Is that correct? Great. So I am here in part because I had the distinct pleasure while I was working at the Center for Sustainable Development of working on a book called Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development. And I've been asked to present today some of the main takeaways of the book to you and kind of unpack a little bit of the connection between ethics, sustainable development, and even religion and spirituality. To start off, I want to just ask you all a question, which is, what is ethics and how does it relate to sustainable development and the SDGs? So you might be aware that ethics, formally understood, is a branch of philosophy. Philosophy is the study of knowledge. It's the study of who we are, what the world is. It's the kind of the mother of all disciplines in some sense. And ethics is a branch within philosophy that generally deals with what humans think is right and what humans think is wrong. It deals with judgments. It deals with how we make decisions. It deals with questions of value and what we think is good or bad. And it deals with, making value judgments about, is it better to do this or better to do that? So first, just to unpack kind of a really simple ethical question to get us started, I want to ask you all, is it okay to help a friend cheat in class? And if you could put it in the chat, what would you have to know in order to make a decision like this? And what would influence what you think about this question? And what I mean by that is, maybe we don't think it's generally okay to help a friend cheat in class, but are there any conditions or circumstances that would make it excusable or justifiable? What if that friend had a really hard week at home and there was something in his or her family life that made it difficult for them to get ahead in class and they needed a break, a kind of a catch-up period, and you're able to help your friend, kind of just consider this, like what would impact whether or not you think it's right or wrong. And the point of this exercise, I can't see the chat for some reason. I don't know if anyone's posting in there. The point of this exercise is just to point out that ethics has to do with what we value and how we make decisions. And similarly, sustainable development is also a form of global decision making, obviously at a much larger scale. And it deals with how we prioritize environmental and social issues along with economic development, which Rachel pointed out in her presentation. And because sustainable development has to do with decision making and ethics informs how we make decisions, therefore sustainable development is a matter of ethics. So here is a book which I had the honor of co-editing. The context is as follows. In 2015, the international community adopted the 17 SDGs, and just a few months prior, Pope Francis published Laudato Si, which is an important Catholic document, which is written to Catholics, people of faith, and all humans, men and women of goodwill. And kind of, it's an exhortation to care for the environment, to become stewards of the earth. And it's motivated by way of religious and spiritual and ethical reasons. Now, the SDGs, represent kind of what we value globally, what our aspirations are in terms of helping out others, helping the planet, protecting the planet and others. And they kind of serve as a criteria or a guide of sorts for international decision making. And it's imperfect, but that's the purpose that it's supposed to serve. So, in the context of the SDGs being published and this important religious document coming out in 2015, Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, who is the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy, started an initiative, which was a 3-year project to bring together religious leaders, philosophers, and practitioners from a whole bunch of different academic and development disciplines to talk about the concept of sustainable development and to discern whether or not there was a moral consensus between all the participants on the values and ethical ideals that are represented or embedded within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We know that religions and cultures and different secular ethical traditions, have a lot of differences, but is there some kind of largest common denominator between what these different viewpoints bring to the table when it comes to the SDGs and the 2030 agenda? So I just want to quickly highlight 3 main takeaways from our book. The first has to do with the good news, which is yes, major religions and ethical traditions to a certain extent do share a vision of the common good and the SDGs. The second takeaway is that religious traditions and communities do offer us important resources for helping to advance sustainable development. This takes the form of what my friend and philosopher Owen Flanagan and others call moral capital, but they also have practical social resources for helping to achieve sustainability. And the third takeaway, and kind of a consensus of the group in the project and in the book itself, is that the intentional cultivation of virtues or values is necessary for achieving sustainable development. So I'll unpack these a little more specifically. The first point, the major religions and secular ethical traditions do see their own values and ethical ideals embedded within the SDGs, and they share a vision of the common good. Let's flesh this out a little more. So generally speaking, the world's largest religious traditions generally recognize some form of universal human dignity, meaning all humans are worthy of respect and have value, intrinsic value, that doesn't depend on what they do or who they are. They generally recognize in some form that life is a gift that can be received, meaning we're not responsible for the fact that we exist in the universe. It kind of was not our doing that we were born into the world wherever we are. Third, all of creation in spiritual terms, or the world, the cosmos, the universe, is interconnected, and every part of it is valuable because it's all interconnected. And finally, of course, all these traditions generally see to some extent that humans are imperfect, that there is either brokenness in the Judeo-Christian kind of genealogy of traditions. There is a view of sin, there's a view of human frailty, etc. So that's kind of what the religions, speaking simplistically, agree upon. And there's some kind of there's some implications from that have to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. They share the same ethical ideals, which include, 1, the belief that all humans have rights, including the right to have basic economic needs met. 2, they agree that compassion, mercy, and service to others, especially the poor and the least well off, are of the highest value and are some of the most important activities we can participate in. 3, that we should respect the environment and treat it well, and stewardship is an important concept here. And 4th, through practice, we can and should become better versions of ourselves, who care more about the environment, about social justice, and about economic well-being for everybody on the planet. So that's the first takeaway. Yes, there is some common understanding of the ethics within the SDGs amongst major religious traditions. The second is that religious communities and spiritual traditions offer these important resources for advancing sustainability. What are these resources? Well, first is what we can call moral capital, which is basically the kind of rituals, practices, and ideas, philosophical and theological ideas that basically help religious adherents to become better humans. So components of like the moral capital that religious traditions contain can include what are called wisdom traditions, which have scriptures and sacred texts, and these texts are considered authoritative for life and conduct. And that means that people can kind of quote and cite these texts as grounds for justifying, why you should or should not do something. These traditions, or at least some of them, also have hundreds or thousands of years of history of ethical teaching, interpretation, and debate, and they have more or less, continuity over the course of their lifetimes. But this means that there's really a wellspring of resources and interpretation to draw upon. And then there are also just these physical and spoken and musical rituals and practices which these traditions have, which help to inculcate different virtues in the community members. Second, more practically, is just the fact that these traditions and communities have very important, valuable social resources and practical experience, like gathering people to pursue a common goal. So experts, Bill Vendley and Jeffrey Sachs have pointed out that religious leaders or communities rather are frequently experts in multi-stakeholder engagement. What does that mean in plain terms? They're good at putting together a bunch of very different people in a room and figuring out some common plan of attack on a commonly held goal, or maybe they disagree, but they're brought together in the same room to see if there are any points of agreement and kind of collaboration that can be achieved. Religious communities and networks are very tightly embedded in local communities, which is seen as a strategic point for achieving different parts of the 2030 agenda. They also kind of exist within and help to create strong networks of social trust, which is important for achieving buy-in and consensus on some of the goals of sustainable development. And finally, religious traditions are already engaged in direct service provision, meaning whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's Jewish groups, Islamic groups, Buddhist groups, Hindu groups, these groups are engaged in providing education, in providing social services, and even development aid directly to populations all over the world, in both the developed world and the developing world. So religious communities and spiritual traditions offer important resources for achieving sustainable development. It's also worth pointing out that, at least as of the last estimate, 84% of the world has some sort of religious affiliation, including both kids and adults. So that's just to point out the fact that religion, it's no jump from there to the perspective that religion may have some role to play in achieving a global development agenda. Finally, the intentional cultivation of virtues and values is required if we are to integrate our moral and ethical aspirations in our political and economic life. So this is where we get a little heady, but this is where a lot of the participants in the Ethics in Action Initiative agreed that a specific school of philosophy called virtue ethics is important for dealing with some of the problems we're talking about. So virtue ethics has to do with basically the fact that becoming either a better person or a good person, or becoming more ethical or more environmentally friendly, for instance, becoming virtuous requires practice, training, conversation, and self-reflection. I can't just think myself towards becoming a more environmentally conscious consumer or someone who treats others more fairly or more justly. It's something that we all have to work on intentionally. It takes it takes participation in communities with other people who share the same goals. And this is something that religious communities are obviously experts in. But it's not something that only religious communities do. Schools do this, shared interest clubs do this. And the idea is that at the individual level, at the corporate level, and at the community or town level, we need to train and teach ways of being in the world that are aligned with what we want to achieve in the environmental dimension, in the economic dimension, and in the social dimension of sustainable development. So I think we'll leave that there. And just as one bonus takeaway, I wanted to share that for me personally, a highlight here was that 3 years of sustained dialogue between people with dramatically different backgrounds, whether religious, cultural, or intellectual. These 3 years generated really meaningful, special friendships for people from these different backgrounds, myself included. So I will end there and happy to take any questions. I'll also look in the chat now to see if anyone said anything.